Political studies at Bar-Ilan. His research interests include international relations, Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, Israeli politics and arms control. He works with a number of international organizations, including NATO. He participates in Track 2 workshops and the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, and is the founder of the program on conflict management and negotiation at Bar-Ilan University. He is, of course, a well-known columnist and commentator in Israeli, British, and American media.
And a frequent guest.
And a frequent guest on IBA News.
Thank you very much. I could sing and do this. Well, I guess I can't do this. I get 14 minutes? Negotiate high, that's how you do it. I'm Israeli, I'm going to negotiate. I could use all my 7 minutes to thank and compliment the organizers, students who did, I agree with everything that was said, an amazing job in a very difficult environment. I was in South Africa at Limud about 2 years ago, and I could, for many reasons, couldn't have done what they did. But particularly, it's the most difficult environment that I've ever been in. Maurice Ostroff, I think I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Maurice asking me to come. From Jerusalem, after a day of teaching, to come out to Herzliya, it's almost like going Chutz La'aretz. But if there's somebody that has learned how to fight this political war, and that's what this is, ladies and gentlemen. This is political warfare. And Maurice has always shown the ability to... Maurice knows that when you fight political warfare, number one, you never win on defense. Number two, you need a strategy, and you need tactics that match that strategy. I agree, unfortunately, with the comments that were made. The Israeli government, to a large degree, has neither strategy, nor tactics, nor troops, nor weapons, nor training. It's very frustrating to have meetings after meetings and be told, well, yes, maybe, and yes, we'll have some budget, and then we don't have budget at the last minute and all sorts of other things. So we have to do this ourselves. It's our country. And we have to take it upon ourselves to change, to fight back in this it's a dirty political war. It's created out of lies. It's an extension of the same war. We can go back to the 1920s. We can go back to November 29th, 1947, when the Arab-Israeli conflict began, or May 1948, or you take any of those dates. The political warfare to erase Israel from the map has not changed. The tactics have changed, the strategy has changed, but the basic goal is exactly the same, over and over and over again. Now, it's the language of apartheid. It's Israel Apartheid Week. It's BDS. It's Stephen Hawking. You see it every day. It's the Church of Scotland saying God has turned his back on the Jews, and that's why we are against the state of Israel. You see it day after day. When I went into this business, when I started to move from the work that I was doing to specifically focusing on this political war, the day that it started, well, it was actually 3 months earlier, it was the preparatory conference for the Durban NGO forum that took place in early September 2001. I don't know if any of you were there in Durban, South Africa at the time. But if you were there, you certainly know that that was a full-fledged declaration of war. It was actually the text, the framework was created in Tehran at what was called the Preparatory Conference of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. We can thank the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, for having presided over that. Not even, the word circus doesn't even apply to that. In Tehran, there was a meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism to create the framework for running this political war against Israel using the language of human rights. That language, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was written and adopted by the new United Nations immediately after the Holocaust. It was post-Shoah. And now that same language and the mechanisms that were created for that, the Human Rights, now called Council, in the United Nations, which just, I think, elected Iran as its president for the next 6 months. You could laugh at this, but it's day after day, week after week. It's exactly how this works. And that's my point. That we have to develop our side, and I went into this because I was asked after the Tehran conference, before the Durban conference, by the Israeli Foreign Ministry and the Jewish Agency, would I be part of an Israeli delegation to Durban? And I said no for a number of reasons. One was a week before Rosh Hashanah, my wife would let me out of the house, and she was right. But beyond that, we had already lost that battle. It was too late to do anything, and what they were planning to do, well, they didn't really have a plan, was, I think, a better way of putting it. What I saw through that process, watching it carefully, from Durban to Stephen Hawking with Goldstone in between, and other major battles which we were very poorly prepared for, was that in this political war, you have to be able to do that strategy, find out where the fire is coming from, and come up with an appropriate response. And nobody was dealing with what I saw. We have wonderful people dealing with the media. We have wonderful people dealing with students and providing the framework so that students could go and fight that war. Nobody was dealing with the human rights community, the network, the non-governmental organizations that ran Durban. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. There were 1,500 organizations. Somebody paid the tickets for most of them. Some were South African. The South African organizations played a central role with their Palestinian friends. And let's remember that the main speakers at that conference were Yasser Arafat and the father of someone who claimed to be the father of Mohammed al-Dura, who allegedly had been killed a year earlier by Israelis in cold blood. That what we call Pallywood was the beginning of that war. Those were the speakers, and 1,500 organizations sent delegates. 5,000 people were in that stadium in Durban to declare war against Israel. And if you look at the text, the number of times the word apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing appears with respect to Israel exceeds 10, and nothing else in that resolution and that declaration had any substance whatsoever. This was a declaration of war against Israel run through the human rights facade, the network. I disagree with, I think it was David who said that some of these organizations are poor. I think it's an important point to make. These organizations are wealthy. The organizations that lead us, yes, there are other ones that are scraped together small funds. But Amnesty International, last time I checked, had an annual budget of 200 million pounds, British pounds. That's real money. It's not shekels, it's dollars, it's real money, pounds. Anybody here have a European passport? I specifically want to ask your assistance when I'm finished in a couple of minutes. Leah will pull me off the stage when I run out of time. The European Union and its constituent members provide somewhere between 70 and 100 million euros for this war. You cannot turn around, you cannot open a newspaper, Jerusalem Post or Haaretz or The Guardian or The Economist or just about anything else, or turn on the BBC without seeing evidence of this NGO war. The Church of Scotland did what it did, or now is rescinded, or is reconsidering its recommendations because of organizations like Sabeel, the Palestinian Ecumenical Liberation Theology Organization, which is funded primarily to promote and goes from city to city, place to place with a Jewish partner, which is also funded by the European Union using exactly the language of the Durban Declaration of War, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all of those things. And as Leah said at the beginning, this is not about a two-state solution. It's not about boundaries or settlements or occupation. This is about November 29th, 1947, and nothing else. And this is paid for, if you're a European citizen, by your tax euros. If you're a British subject, by your pound. When I said anybody European citizen, I also meant the UK, by the way. Sometimes it's forgotten. These governments, through all sorts of mechanisms which I don't have time to describe, and don't have my PowerPoint to show you pictures of, there's an organization called Electronic Intifada. I think at every Israel Apartheid Week, event that takes place, certainly in the United States and parts of Europe, electronic intifada is involved. Their money comes from the Dutch government under a humanitarian aid framework through a church organization. They get 120 million euros a year. That big, it's called ICO, that big church framework, and they have a Palestinian desk. And the woman who gives them that money also writes for electronic intifada. And so it goes over and over and over again. Now, I don't want to leave everybody depressed. You guys are very depressing, I have to say. But there was, as some of you pointed out, even Trevor, I think, Trevor talked about what he was able to get the BBC to do. There is not a European ambassador in Israel who's unaware of the work that NGO Monitor does, and I'm not just tooting my own horn. It's the same thing is true for each of these. For honest reporting, there's not a journalist who doesn't know about honest reporting. Each one of these organizations has a function. We are self-defined, self-created outsourcers of this war. The ambassadors know about us. Some of them run the other way. Some of us quietly give us information. The foreign ministries in Europe know about us. I get reports back of somebody saying, I tried to provide some information. I mentioned NGO Monitor, and the minister immediately had to leave. We get this information. Human Rights Watch has a committee, as a small group that meets every time that NGO Monitor does a report on their activities. My point is, we can fight these battles, we can win them. Europe provides about 10% less money this year than it did last year, partly because they have less, partly because of embarrassment. Every month or so we find about another 200,000 euros that were cut from this organization or that organization. We lost a battle, a small battle, we didn't get to the battlefield, in the European Court of Justice, but now we asked for the documents on this funding for these organizations that lead these wars against Israel. And we were told these are top secret because releasing them would be a danger to public security. We now have about 10 members of the European Parliament who've said to the European Commissioner in sessions of Parliament, we do not understand your policy on this, would you please explain it? And you can, at each of the responses, see the mumbling of the European commissioners. They don't want to have this raised in Parliament. They don't want these dirty little secrets to come out. The main weapon that we have, all of us, is naming and shaming. We're still a small country, surrounded by enemies. I'm not as pessimistic as Trevor about Israel's ability to withstand a more grave situation, even if the United States not producing the vetoes and not supporting Israel. But we are still very much isolated. The main reason that we have these difficulties is because there are, 7 million, 8 million of us, and there are how many millions of Arabs and Muslims in Europe pounding away at this propaganda. And all of these organizations that I talked about, and the media, it is very easily understood from power-based strategic elements using moral camouflage and facade to promote those kinds of interests. But there's an embarrassment factor. There is naming and shaming when the contradictions are brought out. The European Union, the Dutch foreign minister, doesn't like it when it turns out that they're funding electronic intifada for humanitarian aid and it's done in secret. So I think that the positive message is that it took us 10 years from Durban to even get into the ballgame. It took 10 years for the foreign ministry to appoint somebody whose job it is to at least try to deal with some of this. It'll take us maybe another 10 years to get that appointee or an assistant or two and create a real process of fighting this political war within the government. But the activities of my colleagues on this panel, the activities of Maurice Ostroff, of Truth Be Told, the activities of students like these have and can continue to make an important difference. So I would say we have to look for where we can find those openings. And we can press point. Nobody can withstand the evidence. Maybe a Saudi can withstand it, but almost nobody can withstand the evidence of having Israeli students saying, I live there. I don't have apartheid. And to see the tremendous moral contradictions every day when Israel is attacked for violations of human rights, and you look, we're closer to Syria and Herzliya than I am into Jerusalem. You look at what's going on in Syria and you say, and we're the ones being attacked by Richard Falk, a lifelong hater of Israel for human rights violations. The absurdities scream out. And we have to continue to point out those absurdities day after day, month after month. It's hard to do. Those of you who can say to your European leaders that you pay taxes or at least have a passport for, why are you doing this? Why are you providing money? And the last thing I want to say is we have to be specific in our response. Saying this is wrong, replying with language that is very offensive, expresses the anger, but it doesn't accomplish anything. A one-page, half-a-page letter to a European government saying, under the requirements of freedom of information, I would like to know the documents justifying the funding for a group called Coalition of Women for Peace, which is leading the boycott movement against Israel throughout the world, and you say you're opposed to boycotts, would you please explain that? That will cause more damage, more embarrassment, and more likely to lead to an end to that funding than any amount of name-calling and screaming. What turned Richard Goldstone around was the day-to-day pressure of realizing that everything in his 500-page report was a lie. It did not help to attack him when he went to his grandson's bar mitzvah on a personal basis. That made him stronger. That certainly, or his defenders stronger. He's being attacked personally. What broke down the wall was to show on a day-to-day basis that his legacy will be 500 pages of immorality and lies. And in my conversation with with Judge Goldstone, that was the point that made the difference. We need to repeat that to show in every decent person that the position that they take because of this tremendous flood of propaganda and lies is immoral and wrong. I haven't given up on Stephen Hawking. I don't have a lot of hope that he will say that, but that is exactly the process that we need to take. Thank you.